Hello, everyone. Welcome to a brief history of everything and our American half-century series. We are back, and as always, and I like being able to say, as always, Thomas.
Hello.
So obviously, there's been the minisodes. As we are recording this, we've only released minisode 1, but the others will be out in time for you. So you'll be going, no, they're there. What do you mean? What we wanted to get into is we want to really get into 1919 to 1928. And have a bit of a chat about that. And there's a lot of fascinating things coming in this period.
Yeah, it's the 10 years of America where America becomes America.
Yes, it really is. And there's a lot of things people who have listened to us before know there are certain things we're going to dive in on where there's going to be a little bit of, we are political nerds. There will be a fair bit of diving in. There are some conventions which are fascinating.
Rabbit holes galore.
Oh, boy, there are rabbit holes galore. But we are also going to focus on the business of America.
Which is, after all, business.
Business, exactly. The business of America is business, and we're going to look at when the business of America became business, which really is this period which we're looking at of 1919 to 1928. And the business of America kind of begins with Woodrow Wilson, the hero, the conqueror, returning from Paris to a really lukewarm reaction.
Yes, it's sort of like you're going to a party and you think you're going to be the centre of attention, and yet no one really cares you're there. Maybe the bartender because you tip well, but that's about it.
It's really funny because, Wilson, obviously, when he goes over, he's a hero and, all these people in Europe love him. And then by the time the terms start leaking out about what's coming out of Versailles, all these people are like, you betrayed us. And I'm like, well, I don't know how much he necessarily betrayed you per se, as he was involved in negotiations in a global treaty, which is going to probably lead to you're not getting all 14 points.
Yeah, it's certainly there's such a complex relationship between Wilson and World War I, America, World War I, Wilson, World War I, and America. It's such a difficult thing to unpack because Wilson's whole re-election in 1916 is to keep them out of the war. And then he finds himself taking America into the war, being perceived over the ditch as this great addition to the Entente powers who aren't the Entente anymore because Russia's fallen out, and the great saviour to turn the tide and win the war. He thinks he's this great internationalist because he's been hailed as a hero by the Europeans, but forgetting quite simply that America's natural instinct in this period of time and the preceding period of time is isolationist, is disengagement. And so when he comes back with this treaty, which had been promised as this great way in which to replace force and war with law and legislation, it goes nowhere.
There's a couple of things at play as well, because Wilson, the other interesting part is that Wilson kind of screws it up with some political missteps on the home front, which is largely he gets a lot of support, obviously, wartime presidents do. So he has a lot of Democratic and Republican supporters who are like, okay, we're in this now, so we're going to, the Lusitania obviously sort of solidified a lot of that. But in 1918, for example, he goes sort of and actively campaigns for Democrats, which everyone's like, I thought you weren't going to do that. Then the other problem is he puts together the delegation to go over and do the Paris Peace Conference and does not include any Republicans. Leaves them out of the negotiations. And the Republicans are kind of understandably going, well, hang on a minute, this is supposed to be this sort of unity sort of moment here. Why are we not included in the conversation?
Yeah, it's certainly not as partisan as we understand politics today. The left-right divide, the Democrat-Republican divide, it's there, but there's a more enlightened sense of compromise and negotiation and inclusivity at this period of time. Not necessarily on everything, but on something like this where you're reshaping essentially the world sphere, at least the Western world sphere, and the influence of world powers. You would think, and as they rightly did, some elder statements from the Republican Party, one name in particular, Henry Cabot Lodge,
yes,
would have been an included voice to try and make sure that there was a bipartisan way through this.
And we'll talk a bit more about Lodge in a minute, but I think where it's really interesting is that The 14 points, and you sort of mentioned this obviously in minisodes, is the 14 points, the idea of the 14 points is supposed to be this idealistic version of what the world could be. But almost from the get-go, the 14 points have no bearing on reality. Like the treaties, and the Treaty of Versailles, and all of the treaties being negotiated, there's only really the Big Four doing anything. Yeah. No one else is involved. It's the Big Four are going to come up with it, and then we'll tell you what we came up with, which goes against large chunks of Wilson's 14 points, which is about self-determination and the right of countries to sort of, some of these countries to make decisions for themselves. I mean, the Americans had maps printed up that were clear. That's kind of their biggest contribution that ends up happening. Like, the 14 points is a great starting point, but the clear map is kind of the most important thing they bring, because by the time Wilson sort of leaves, he hasn't got much of what he wanted. And he kind of comes back with everyone going, well, you talked a lot, but what did you get?
Yeah, the way in which the Versailles Treaty evolves out of the 14 points is a very complex thing. The 14 points was largely a speech delivered in Congress for the Germans to listen to say, if you're planning on surrendering, this is probably the best you're going to get. At which point the Germans go, that's great. That's better than anything we thought we'd get. Where do we sign up for this? Then the 14 points turn nothing into the Treaty of Versailles, and Germany's dissatisfied with that because they thought they were promised 14 points. But Wilson himself starts selling out on his own principles because he just wants a League of Nations and he just wants more internationalism. And the big convention or the big conference, it turns from all of the winners into the big six, into the big five, into the big four. Because, I mean, for a period of time, Japan is actually listened to.
Until they ask for the whole, racial equality clause put in there, and everyone goes, what do you mean?
What? We're not renegotiating these sorts
that's not going to backfire in any way, shape, or form. We're not going to talk about Japan again.
No, Japan's just going to sort of drift off into the wilderness, aren't they?
Don't know what happened.
And even the big four turns into the big three because Orlando just gives up. He goes, I'm getting nothing. Italy's getting screwed here. And
to be fair, the Italy's getting screwed here idea is Italy in World War I, which is we made treaties with everyone and didn't quite know which side to fight on.
I mean, the Italian half century would be one hell of a podcast series.
Look, we don't have enough. There's 900 episodes of the Italian half century, and I don't have that kind of time.
No, nor do I have that the amount of the
of life left.
Yeah, life left. I don't have years to spend going into just one decade.
No, but realistically, it's three. It's Wilson, it's Clemenceau, and it's Lloyd George. They're the three doing the whole thing.
And poor Lloyd George standing in the middle trying to hold these two, let's kill the Germans versus let's rebuild the world. And
Clemenceau and Lloyd George is going, I kind of agree with Wilson, but I've kind of promised what Clemenceau said. I don't quite know how to do this. Help? Like David Lloyd George, whenever you see photos of them walking out of the conference, Lloyd George always strikes me as somebody who's like being held captive against his will. He has this look of terror on his face at all times, like, I don't know what's really happening here. These two want to kill each other.
Yeah, it's the idealism versus the pragmatism versus revenge. That's the three themes.
They're definitely the motives coming out of the whole treaty. And as you pointed out, really it's Wilson's 14th point is the only one he cares about.
Yeah, if he can walk away with a League of Nations, he will be happy. But what he severely underestimates is, will the rest of America be happy? And the short answer is no.
The funniest part about it, and let's get into Lodge, because I think Lodge is the most important, because there are a couple of camps that are dealing with what's happening with the Treaty of Versailles. You've got there are sort of revisionists who are okay with the general concept, but would like a few changes. Then there are the hardcore, no, we're never doing this.
Never, ever.
This is not happening. We are an isolationist nation. I think isolationism gets played as the major card, but I don't think that isolationism is necessarily... Like, you can't just go, the reason that America doesn't do this is isolationism.
Yeah,
it's a bit more complicated than that, because there were enough Republicans who were prepared to go along if Wilson gives a bit of ground.
Yeah, I think you and I were talking about this before, and for me, there's the argument of sovereignty, which is what Lodge couches everything in there, and then there's also the sort of linguistic or argument of language, where if the language was flexible enough to accommodate the concerns of the American politic, then it could probably be passed, and then if reassurances or clauses that promised American sovereignty could have been injected into the treaty, then Lodge himself, who by this point is on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and perceives himself as the sort of gatekeeper of all American foreign politics, if that could have been accommodated, then it would have stood a better chance. And then going back, not taking any Republican voices to include this in the conference is probably an issue in and of itself.
Like, the interesting part with what Lodge put forward. So, Lodge has a couple of massive issues. Funnily enough, he puts forward 14 reservations to
just as many points.
Exactly. He just wants to have the same number.
I'm surprised he didn't go 15.
I would have gone one more if I was him, just to be spiteful.
Yeah.
But there are things like the idea that they should be compelled to deal with border issues between neighbouring countries as members of the League of Nations. And he's like, compelled? Should we really be compelled? Compelled is actually a thing that is a large part of this, is that a lot of the feeling within the Republican circles, and especially within the Lodge sort of camp, is there's too much compelling the United States to do things, when what it should be is that America can weigh up as part of
what's
the League
in
of
their best
Nations
interests
and make their own decisions. They also get a little bit antsy at things like, how they're going to view territory purchases and territory, and especially they want to put a clause in there about the Monroe Doctrine.
Yes.
And let's not. You can't wind any of our stuff back. No questioning us on Monroe.
No.
Can't bring that up.
No. And what I think we see the League of Nations turn into is this sort of toothless, feckless thing where even if those compulsions were there, but they end up not being there, they never would have compelled anyone to do anything. For example, ask the Manchurians, to what extent was the League of Nations at all compelled to save those poor people from the Japanese?
And interestingly enough, one of the reservations that Lodge puts forward is about the transfer of Shandong Peninsula to Japan. And Lodge is like, but that means that if China and Japan do eventually go to war, which, let's face it, probably likely at some point, that means we kind of have to take the Japanese side on things. Why?
Yeah.
I don't understand that.
What
that
if they're not the best side of
What is this whole idea about you want large parts of Europe to have this idea of they can have a bit of self-determination and make their own decision? But on the other hand, you're happy to just transfer Shandong province from German control.
There's inherent inconsistencies in the whole thing.
And this is the thing. There are a lot of the Lodge issues that do sort of come out and you look at it and go, no, I understand where he's coming from on this. And the question that then gets asked is, well, why are the Lodge concerns not folded into this, and why does America not sort of come up with a compromise solution almost to ratify the League of Nations and ratify the Treaty of Versailles? And the answer is simple. Woodrow Wilson comes back and feels the need to go and campaign for this.
Yeah.
Because
though it's a political issue.
Because he comes back, he expects that he's still going to be this amazingly wonderful, loved man. Comes back and he's not. He gives 37 speeches in 22 days trying to sell the idea.
Solid effort.
And has a massive stroke.
Funny, that's the outcome.
Now,
for a guy who's had a history of stroke and poor health.
So just to sort of dip in a little bit into Wilson's health background, because I think it's important. Wilson's health has never been good. His first massive stroke was while he was at Princeton in 1896, and there are some historians who argue that he'd never shown an interest in politics, and it's the 1896 stroke that sort of there are personality changes there, and one of them is that he seems to suddenly want to seek public office. So it's like a stroke got him there. But then he has a number of other strokes. We're not just talking about this one. There's a lot of discussion about 1911. There's supposed to be a stroke.
Yeah, these kind of mini strokes. Yeah.
There's another stroke in 1913. He has a horrible health record. And basically Woodrow Wilson has had, it depends on which sort of person you believe, but there are enough people. Edwin Weinstein talks about the idea, the historian talks about the fact that Woodrow Wilson had a lot of strokes, and that basically all of these strokes manifest themselves in the personality changes and eventually lead to this weird period where Wilson is trying to campaign for a League of Nations, Wilson is trying to campaign for signing and ratifying the Treaty of Versailles, but he's not in any position to actually then guide what the Democratic position on this is going to be in Congress. And as a result, it all falls to pieces.
I think I remember reading one Wilson biography, I think it was by Wilson, in that the stroke brings on a sense of mortality for Wilson, that he sees that death is not terribly far away, and he throws himself into everything with absolute abandon, that he's going to die sooner or later, and he needs to leave his mark on the world, as probably most intellectuals, which is what we categorize him as, see themselves. They've got to leave their mark, and it needs to be a big, long-standing mark. And the League of Nations is it. It's reshaping the entire world from its foundation all the way up. If he was able to achieve this, Wilson the man becomes Wilson the legend.
Yes.
Ignoring aside all of his controversial issues, showing Birth of a Nation in the White House and all that sort of stuff. Let's not get into that. That predates 1919. But he sees himself as this great emancipator of world, from the old world to the new world. And it's this commitment to this idea where he really just runs himself to death.
Yeah, and I mean, It's often been discussed by historians now when they reflect on the period, that idea of, look, for all intents and purposes, after 1919, America has a dead president. Yeah. Like, he's not officially dead. He doesn't officially die for 3 more. He actually technically outlasts Warren Harding, but he doesn't. Like, he's basically, there's a lot of doctors and there's a lot of medical records and evidence that sort of suggests that by the end of, early 1920, Woodrow Wilson is basically brain dead. He's not really able to function in a way that is meaningful as the President of the United States. He's incapacitated. A lot of conversation around the fact that his wife is making a lot of decisions in the White House and is guiding a lot of what's coming out of the White House.
She does defend her position there, saying all she did was make decisions on what was important enough to take to my essentially incapacitated husband and occupy his very limited skills with, and then the rest would just get pushed back down with an effective order of do what you think is best and is in the best interest of the presidency. Go away and do that. But even a decision on what is and isn't important is pretty important.
The very fact that the wife of the president is filtering what information he's allowed to hear, that's a concern.
Now, don't get me wrong. I've got no issue with a wife or a husband making those decisions, but it's the unelected nature of Edith. Yeah, it's nothing to do with anything other than the fact that Wilson was elected into that position. Edith was not. Wilson should be either making the decisions or be determined as incapacitated, despite there not being the explicit clauses in the Constitution that we see now about that.
And that's the problem. The problem with this whole situation, there's 2 problems. First of all, there's no clause that allowed them to remove an incapacitated president. But secondly, the way that the Wilson family and Wilson's doctors in particular cover this up.
Yeah, you wouldn't have even known.
Right? It's about that idea of the national interest and this idea of the cover-up of Wilson's health, which is Woodrow Wilson, as I said, is basically unable to make decisions for himself to that level that a president should be able to do. And as a result of this, you go, well, obviously then he's not necessarily fit to serve, but nobody in the Democratic Party knows. There's rumours at one point that Wilson's healthy enough that he's going to give a speech to Congress about the League of Nations. That doesn't really happen. He can't bring himself to do it. And when we get into what happens in the election coming up, it really impacts the election because the Democrats don't know if the sitting president is alive or dead and is going to run for another term or not.
Yes.
So there are so many questions. No one within his own political party, almost nobody within the cabinet knows what the hell is the situation with Wilson.
It's just rumours.
Right, so the cabinet is in rumour about what's happening with the president. The cabinet should not be in that level of sort of flux.
No.
So there's a reason why the League of Nations isn't ratified. There's a reason why Versailles is not ratified. And I think it's really interesting to look at the idea, if you look at the Lodge, what Lodge puts forward, huge elements of Lodge's doctrine find their way into eventually, when we'll get there later on, what happens with the UN.
Yes.
With the US getting a veto and a lot of the powers that are in the United Nations.
Yeah, his arguments against sovereignty.
Yeah, Lodge gets a lot of what he puts in those his 14 rebuttal points are put into what ends up becoming the United Nations. So there's a bit of a shift there. But in the meantime, there are a couple of issues around this not being ratified, which is, first of all, America has just started to now emerge as the power, right? Their arrival into the war, the way that Wilson is sort of fated as this great hero initially, America's influence, and we're going to get into what's happening in America economically, which is bigger than this. But America is now on the precipice of being this great global power, and suddenly from Congress there's this Nope.
Nah.
No,
We're
you
good.
know what? We're going to stay over here.
Yeah, it's at this point we sort of need to diverge into sort of big theme history and then more nuanced history. And I quite enjoy the big theme history of this as much as the nuanced history. And it leads us into what are the Roaring Twenties.
Yes, exactly. So the thing is that America on one hand is we don't want to be a military power. We're not going to be the world's police officer. We don't believe that it's our role to be involved in global affairs.
Very familiar. I feel like I've heard that recently.
All the time. It feels like this is, again, there's a constant flux. One of my favourite jokes of all time remains from a Not the 9 o'clock news episode in the 1980s with Reagan talking
There's
about...
a deep cut.
Yeah, with Reagan talking about nuclear disarmament and the idea of their escalating tensions in the Cold War with Russia, where the joke was that America wants to make up for being late for the last two world wars by being really punctual this time. And it's kind of true, though. Like, America's like, no, we're not involved. No, we're not involved. No, we're not involved. But at the same time, America to the rest of the world is buy our stuff.
Oh, yeah. The tension between America's non-want to be engaged with the world, except in your wallet, is literally the sort of juxtaposition of America at this time. We're good for cash, but we're not good for much else.
The consumerism and commercialisation of the United States, and we'll get into bits and pieces of it as we look at the different presidencies in this part. But just as an overview statement, it's really interesting to note that America's consumerism and America's idea is we don't want to have anything to do with you, but we believe that our products are so important and so good, you have to deal with us. So we don't have to deal with you in any way, shape or form. You, on the other hand, will do what we want economically.
But you got to remember that they've got the rest of the world sort of, what's the most appropriate? I was going to say by the some things.
Yes.
They've got them held over a barrel.
They are.
Because pretty much every victor nation of World War I owes America money. America was the credit card to win World War I.
Exactly, and now it's due.
Yeah, we'll take the interest payments.
It's like one of those ones where they go, no interest for 24 months. And you go, that's fantastic. And then in month 25, they're like, guess what? Massive interest payment. What we'll do is instead, we'll just take all of your economic business. You can give us all of the trade. You buy exclusively from us now. You don't buy from them, you buy from us. Now,
and in return, we're also going to jack up our tariffs so we don't have to buy from you as well.
And so let's get into this, because this is all part of this idea of the Roaring Twenties, and this is all part of this idea of American exceptionalism. And American exceptionalism drives everything. This idea that the United States is better and somehow predestined to be better.
Yeah, you can trace that whole line of thought all the way back to, Manifest Destiny, Westward Expansion, and there's a whole series of talking and listening involved in that. And
where we need to sort of get to with this is we need to have a conversation about who is going to set the tone. And the tone is set in the 1920 election. So let's get into the 1920 election to set the tone before we get into commercialisation and consumerism, because the election of 1920 is the first of a couple of what I would refer to as batshit elections. All America knows at this point in time is that they do not want Woodrow Wilson. But that is all they know. They don't know anything else.
Guess what? You're not going to get him anyway.
Well, you're not going to get Woodrow Wilson, although it's fascinating to watch what happens to Woodrow Wilson, because Woodrow Wilson doesn't actually rule himself out. So at the Democratic primary, as they are approaching the primary, you've got McAdoo, who was the former Treasury Secretary and was probably the guy who was going to be the nominee. He was considered the strongest candidate that existed. He was considered to be the guy who was going to be the hope for the Democratic Party moving forward. The problem was he's Wilson's son-in-law, and because he's Woodrow Wilson's son-in-law, what ends up happening is that Wilson sits there and ums and ahs and goes, I don't quite know, I might still run again, even though, as we've already mentioned before, Woodrow Wilson is largely dead. He's all over the convention tickets, so the tickets to go to the Democratic National Convention all feature Woodrow Wilson's face on them. Wilson himself is still not withdrawn as a candidate per se. McAdoo can't run openly because his father-in-law legitimately just stops him, just says to him, no, you cannot openly campaign for this. So McAdoo is kind of pushed to one side and not allowed to run his campaign until much later than anyone running for president should ever have to do, which then opens the door for a bunch of other candidates in this field. And when you look at the candidates that ran in this field, you end up with James Cox of Ohio, who's the other sort of major one. You also get Al Smith, and he will come up a bit later as well. Mm-hmm. You get John Davis. He will come up again a bit later as well. So you've got all of these sort of candidates putting themselves forward. There were people who were not nominated, people like Thomas Marshall, the vice president, who sort of vaguely goes, I might like the job, please, and everyone's like, who are you?
You had your chance.
Marshall, if you want to talk about people that were left out of conversations with Wilson, Marshall was never consulted about anything. Like,
it was the old school model of the VP.
Yeah, Marshall is the most traditional vice president I think you'll see. Like, everyone was like, oh, Thomas Marshall, vice president. I was like, what?
Who?
Who's this guy?
Who's this guy who keeps hanging around?
So the problem is that McAdoo's set up in a way that he can't really do anything. He can't campaign for the job, even though he's the one that everyone goes, we think it's probably him. And as a result, others are able to sort of steal a march. Yep. Now, the balloting at this convention is nuts.
Crazy nuts.
How much nuts are we talking here? We are talking 44 rounds of voting.
Imagine voting in the same election essentially 44 different ways.
Look, in the West Wing, which was designed and played up for drama, the nomination of Santos didn't take that long.
No.
Like, they played that for drama, and you know what? At some point, someone sat down writing that script and went, not believable.
No one will believe 40-something.
We can't get that far into it. Maybe it's going to be the third round of voting and we'll do it that way. 44 rounds of voting. By the way, in the 44 rounds of voting, Wilson receives 2 votes
just
in the
vote for the guy.
22nd round. And that's it.
I think they're voting just to see if he's still around. Like, let's nominate him, see if he gives a speech.
See if he reacts. Yeah. Is there a wave? Is there a wave? I like the idea, and of course, there's no video footage. Obviously,
have you seen Weekend at Bernie's?
I know. I like the idea that he was up in a box.
Weekend at the White House.
Yeah, not moving. And I just like the idea that she's sitting there holding the arm, and the 2 votes happen, and she like pulls the arm up to wave to everybody.
No, I think what she does is she slips her arm through the armhole, takes his out, and then there's this little lady hand, and that's where his nickname Lady Hands comes from.
Lady Hands Wilson.
Lady Hands Wilson. Have you seen his hands? They're so delicate and petite, and he's got the polish on.
Lady Hands Wilson. I love the idea, though, that the top hat was also there to cover the fact that his head was sloped. So what they did
was... There's like a brace. There's a 2x4.
It's where Franklin Roosevelt would later get the idea. He's got the brace into the hat. It's like holding his head up. It's like, wave to the people. Arm through the whole way.
Hey. Hello.
Lady Hands Wilson's waving.
There he goes.
So 22 rounds of balloting until Wilson gets a vote. 44 rounds of balloting until eventually we get our nominee. And it is not McAdoo. Even though McAdoo gets very close to it, it is James M. Cox, the governor of Ohio.
Devastated that we never got a President McAdoo.
Well, we're going to talk about McAdoo again because he comes back in the next one. McAdoo is back. All right.
The Mac is back.
The Mac is back. Return of the Mac.
Return of the Mac.
I'm not going to sing it because I want a royalty. But so we end up with James Cox, who is the Democratic nominee. Let's face it. Probably wasn't going to win because everyone hated Woodrow Wilson, and this was interesting. So the platform did actually back the League of Nations, but had a qualifier on that of we sort of back it, but they were in favour of women's suffrage, which, let's face it, for the Democratic Party of that era,
very progressive,
is amazing.
Yeah,
because when McAdoo comes back up later on, we are going to have a conversation around McAdoo and, in particular, Klan support, which the Democrats had a lot of.
There's an awkward relationship between the Democrats of the 20s and the Klan.
And the interesting part is that one of the people within the Democratic Party who hated the links with the Klan is the vice presidential nominee for the 1920 election.
Some guy you probably haven't heard of.
Yeah, some weird guy. Hang on a minute. He's got a weird name. Let me just read it. Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
That's are you talking about Theodore Roosevelt? He's the only one, right?
It's a familiar name.
Yeah, it must be the Theodore.
Look, I don't think we're going to see him come up again necessarily in this podcast. I mean, he will come up. But
I wonder whatever came of him.
I think he gave a speech at the 24 convention, but that's about it.
Secretary of the Navy under Wilson.
That was what he had been doing, obviously. You know, he'd been a bit busy, but maybe he went into shipping.
Yeah, maybe.
Shipping magnate.
He was
the Onassis before Onassis was Onassis.
FD Onassis.
Think about it. Jackie Kennedy could have married a Roosevelt
instead of a Kennedy.
Fantastic. Or just marry one dynasty and another one. So the 20 nomination is that. You'd think on the other side with the Republicans, probably a little bit easier because they're looking at this going, well, this is probably a win.
This is just a walk-in, right?
We've got this. Now, as the election starts moving forward, you get to 1919, Teddy Roosevelt is starting to sort of agitate for another run at this.
Yeah,
he wants
as
another
a third-party candidate.
As a third party, or possibly
or as a Republican
coming back into the Republican fold. The Republicans are listening going, we might actually, I know there's a lot of people in the party that hate him, but he'll win. He will win.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of chatter. Now, unfortunately, in 1919, Roosevelt does something that is electorally sort of poor.
It's very difficult to come back from this.
Dies. So that kind of puts a sort of a stick in the spoke,
yes,
as
very
it would,
difficult.
of his political ambitions. Although knowing Teddy Roosevelt wouldn't rule him out.
It is difficult for winning an election, but as Wilson has proven, you can still be president with not much capacity.
Think about what we're missing out on, by the way. We could have had a Woodrow Wilson, Teddy Roosevelt campaign in 1920.
Again.
Dead versus sort of dead.
Nearly dead.
Imagine the campaign. Imagine the weekend at Bernie's nature of that campaign. Stump speeches with people waving. Teddy Roosevelt suddenly, also known as Lady Hands. Why? There's all these lady hands going. You know what I'm thinking? What I'm thinking is more. I don't know if you remember on Sesame Street, the dog. When they would have the dog, when the magic tricks with the ball and the hands. So, there's a guy behind this dog, and the dog's got a shirt on, and there's human hands coming around. This is a ball. I've just got this image now that was how the whole campaign was going to run. They're there's a business shirt, and there's someone working the hands for them.
I think of those sort of high school and then Japanese TV performances where people are all dressed completely in ninja black, and there's people sort of making do the wind and the things are going everywhere.
Kabuki theatre stuff happening.
Yes.
That's great. So there's a problem now. The Republicans are thinking they're going to win an election, but they kind of need a nominee for president.
Generally helps.
Now, in the nomination process, we have probably what should be considered by most people, and if we gave you the list of candidates, you would consider the slam dunk is Major General Leonard Wood.
Yep.
Because he's just obviously come off the back of, World War I.
Yep.
And usually, if you are a war hero who runs for office,
you get it.
You get it.
George Washington,
yep,
from the Revolutionary War. Zachary Taylor, these American-Mexican wars. You've got Andrew Jackson from the
1812.
The 1812 British-American War.
Yep.
Later on, you have Eisenhower after World War II.
You've got Grant.
You've got Grant after the American Civil War.
Yep. So, if you are a war hero and you're of good standing. In Grant's case,
win the war.
Or in Grant's case, you're just Grant. So you win and you're the president. So Leonard Wood was the overwhelming favourite.
After Pershing sort of largely proves unpopular.
Yeah, so he comes back and he sort of seems to be the front runner. You've got the governor of Illinois, Frank Loudon, who runs. You've got Hiram Johnson, who's a senator from California, who runs as well. I said Theodore Roosevelt would have been there had he not died. You've got my favourite candidate, by the way, out of all of them, is Miles Poindexter.
I mean, how have we missed President Poindexter?
President Poindexter was an option.
McAdoo v. Poindexter.
He also became the ambassador to Peru.
Well, that just says America's thoughts on Peru.
Doesn't it really? That's when we get into when we'll talk about foreign policy. When we get into the idea of their policy towards Latin America and South America, I think President Poindexter would have said it all. Herbert Hoover, by the way, does run in this one, and it doesn't go brilliantly.
That's all he does. He does run.
He does run. Herbert Hoover was there too.
Did attend.
So we have Warren Harding is not considered by anybody to be, forget a front runner. He's not even considered a runner.
He's just there.
After the first ballot in the Republican convention, Warren Harding is not in the top 3. He's 6th, and he's a very distant 6th. But Warren Harding's own own campaign manager turned around and basically there's a very famous comment about the idea of the men in the smoky rooms, and this is where this sort of comes from. So the conversation about the smoke-filled room comes from Harry Daughtry, who says, I don't expect Harding to be nominated on the first, second or third ballot, but I think we can take chances at about 11 minutes after 2, Friday morning of the convention, when 15 or 20 weary men are around a table, someone will say, who will we nominate? And at that time, friends of Harding will suggest him, and we can well afford to abide by the result. He's 100% right. That's what happens.
That's largely what happens.
Everyone gets to their... Then they don't go anywhere near the 44 rounds.
And it's not because they've sort of unearthed this gem who no one else has seen. He's just going to be the guy, the front guy, the fall guy for all their corruption and schemes.
It's really interesting because it sort of typifies what is Harding's presidency. Because you have Warren Harding, who is not the guy, he's a guy. Which is kind of a good way to sum him up.
Yeah, he's a guy.
But in his own White House, he has zero influence. And everybody sort of argues that Warren Harding himself was fine. He was a nice enough guy. Well, he had a couple of affairs, but let's face it, everybody did.
If you weren't doing that at that time, that made you abnormal.
I mean, there's a lot when we talk a bit more about Harding the man, there's a lot to be said about a man who can barely move because he's had so many different heart attacks and thinks he might die, but can maintain 2 affairs. I mean, look, kudos in terms of the energy. I mean, morally up to you, but kudos to energy.
This was before Red Bull.
Exactly. Didn't give him wings. But the problem with Harding, though, is that he has no control over anything that happens because he's not the guy. He's been put upon, and so everyone who puts him in that position is going to be able to leverage him. And that's exactly what the Harding presidency becomes, is everyone around him can leverage him because he's got no control.
Yeah, and he's from the wing of the Republican Party that is the conservative wing. It's not progressivism that he's interested in. The Theodore Roosevelt, big president, big actions, lead the nation forward from the front. The conservatives, as we will look at in the sort of economic policies of this decade, are really more interested in a hands-off affair, but literally hands off the wheel and just graft. Yeah. Grafter's going to graft.
Exactly. So the election itself... the electoral vote is not really close. It's 404 to 127. 37 states carried by Harding to 11 states carried by Cox. Interestingly enough, if you were to look at the map and you've only ever looked at modern political maps, you would be absolutely staggered to look at the colours because the northern part of the country, red, the bottom part of the country, blue. And again, that's when we get to the 1960s bit, that's when the flip happens.
The inversion.
Change. My favourite moment of this election, though, remains Eugene Debs.
Oh,
good old Eugene
Debs.
He's
still going.
Debs is fantastic. The best part about this is that this is when Debs gets 3.4% of the vote, and he's still in prison.
Yeah,
at
so
the
he's
time.
campaigning from a prison cell.
He's running from a prison cell, and he gets 3.4% of the vote.
Wouldn't be the first criminal elected to the White House.
And definitely not the last one. So we'll leave it at that. We're not going to mention anyone in particular. I mean, Spiro Agnew did walk in there, but he wasn't elected president. Anyway, and I can say that because he was charged. Moving on, because speaking of people who were charged, let's talk about the Harding presidency, shall we?
Which one? Which charge?
Let's just lead into Teapot Dome straight up, shall we?
And that is the summation, almost like the symbol or the metaphor for the whole administration.
If anybody was happy, obviously posthumously, if anybody was going to be happy that we had Watergate, it's the family and relations of Albert Fall. Because up until Watergate, Teapot Dome is regarded as the biggest political scandal in American history.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to find much better than Teapot other than Watergate.
It's also one of the best named controversies in history. Teapot Dome. Like, I put that forward to a class once and tried to get them to predict what it was about.
What do they go, tea store?
Most of them were talking about smuggling tea. The Teapot Dome scandal.
Teapot Dome scandal off the Revolutionary War, where they dumped the Teapot Dome tea into the harbour.
Look, it actually suits what happened at the Boston Tea Party a lot better than what happened here.
Tea is a fundamental part of American history.
Because Teapot Dome is all about, basically, it's oil speculation and bribery is what it is.
Yeah.
It's taking the Navy has control of the couple of oil fields because that's how they're going to generate the coal to make the ships go, because ships go brum brum off back of coal. But as a result of ships going brum brum off back of coal, the Navy has rights to these oil fields. what happens is they decide to invest in a bit of, what's the word I'm looking for?
Shenanigans?
Hardcore bribery.
Oh.
And so we get a lot of the Teapot Dome area. The oil production rights are leased to Mammoth Oil, and also the Elk Hills Reserve is given to Edward Doney of Pan American Petroleum and Transport. Now, there was no bidding process for this, which was actually mandated under legislation. Now, Fall suddenly becomes very wealthy. There was a loan given to him by Doney. It was of $100,000.
Chump change.
It's about $1.5 million today. Just
a little.
Just about that. And there were also gifts up to about $6 million in value that were given with no...
That's a big turkey.
Yeah. The leases were fine, but the money exchanging hands is not. Now, Fall finds himself in trouble because it's sudden millionaire syndrome. He can't hide it. So I like the idea, because there's a couple of historians who write really good recaps of Teapot Dome, and they all sort of paint it the same way. It's almost like he started walking down the street with a monocle and a top hat, when before that he'd been like a pauper walking around the street in like ripped clothing and like the pockets turned outside with no money and a womp womp.
I'm imagining some sort of like Flavor Flav. He's got like a big clock, big gold chain. He's got the pimp cane, big fur coat. Fell into house.
Fell into his house. But the problem is that Fell kind of makes it very obvious he's suddenly wealthy.
Funny that.
Which means that everyone starts investigating how he's suddenly wealthy, because it was like, where did he get the money from?
I imagine there's two types of investigations, like Republicans who are looking going, this is wrong, and then Republicans going, how can I get me some of that?
It's up to things like, for example, where it sort of came out. It came out in the Albuquerque Tribune. And when was the last great story that they actually
Weird Al Yankovic is the only thing I know from Albuquerque.
Exactly. So the reason it comes due is because he had ranch taxes that were over 10 years old, and suddenly he pays them in cash.
Bit sus.
Up front.
Bit sus.
And the Albuquerque Review goes, did you know that he just paid 10 years worth of taxes up front? That's a lot of taxes for a ranch.
It is.
Where did Fell get the money from? And they start an investigation. Now, the highlight of the inquiry is the idea of who gets charged for bribes.
You would think everyone with a hand in the cookie jar cops a fine, gets some jail time. You know, everyone would be treated equally under the law.
Fall by 1929, because it takes that long, Fall is found guilty of accepting bribes from Doney.
Oh, okay, yeah, that seems like right.
Doney, however, is not found guilty of giving bribes to Fall.
There's a bit of an illogical incongruency there.
It's absolutely ridiculous. It's this idea that one person can be charged for taking the bribe, but the person who gave him the bribe, it's all good. Yep. Perfectly acceptable. So you end up with this weird sort of thing. The only thing that comes out of it for me is where it's the finding that in the Supreme Court that Congress has the power to compel testimony. That's actually the most important thing that comes out of it.
Yeah, it's part of the political evolution.
Right? It's part of where America goes. So it's kind of the best way to sum up what happens within, politically at least, what happens within the administration, because Harding's administration is 21 to 23. Now, he sets the tone, though, for consumerism.
Yes.
So America and consumerism. Nowadays we go, well, it's obvious. That's what America is. But this is the era where that's established.
Yeah, there's no consumer culture before now because there's not really anything to consume. World War I is the pivot point for a lot of this. It's where, certainly in the United States, but also you see in other Western democracies, the quote-unquote common man, which really just means white middle class or white working class man, their concerns are all of a sudden being addressed. It's a resultant from democracy where all of a sudden these people have a voice in the body politic. They've also managed to prove their quote-unquote manhood in World War I. They've come back as returned soldiers and victorious heroes. In the UK, they talk about building a nation fit for heroes. In the United States, it's a discussion of a return to normalcy and that the business of America is business.
Yes, and again, remember, because it becomes important to understand that, of course, you've got Harding and his vice president, Calvin Coolidge. Now, Calvin Coolidge, we're about to talk a bit more about, obviously, for reasons that will become apparent in about 1923. But Calvin Coolidge, it's a very important thing to note there, is that you get the return to normalcy, which is, of course, the Harding slogan, which is what a slogan. It's inspiring to the masses.
Don't pitch too high.
We want things to go back to the way that they've always been.
Like, sort of make America...
The same again.
The same again.
Yeah. Make America whatever it was before. Not even great again, just what it was before.
Just before. Let's not get too great.
Yeah, let's just make America stable.
Let's not let our egos get out of hand here. Let's just keep things normal.
It's almost up there. What it really should have been, it should have been Warren G. Harding. Okay.
Yeah.
That's it. Meh.
Meh. Yeah. Meh. Shrugging shoulders with a meh. That's the GOP.
Look, that would have been the absolute perfect. If memes were around back then, you would have got the campaign slogan would have been Warren G. Harding going shrug with a meh. What are you going to do? And the answer is go consumer crazy. So one of the reasons why America can do this is that the methods of production, which has been spoken about with World War I, America turns this massive industrial potential on. And now suddenly without war production, what are you going to do with all this mechanisation, and what are you going to do with all this new technology? Well, you're going to start producing consumer products. Now, there are positives and negatives to this. The negatives are going to be found in the agricultural sector, because part of the problem is going to be an overproduction in the agricultural sector, and that will become a bit more important, not so much in this episode, but maybe 1929 onwards, there's a massive issue that's going to develop from that.
Yeah, there's something to consider when we talk about the Roaring Twenties, and it's a thing certainly Chris and I do with our classes. Whenever you have like a slogan for an era of time, always add for who after it. Roaring Twenties for who? World War I for who? The Depression for who? You ask these questions because you can't say there's a universal experience of any period in history. And to say the Roaring Twenties for who leads you instantly to the agricultural sector. In World War I, the United States was the breadbasket of the world, because if you think about the agricultural capacity of Europe at this time and their ability to feed their soldiers and citizens, think of the Western Front and the Eastern Front churning up pristine farmlands, that farmers who would have been reaping these harvests are the people who have the soldiers and are doing the killing and dying. So there is a severe shortage both of the capacity to harvest and grow food, but also of the food itself in in the United Kingdom, in France, in Germany, in Russia, all these places. And so they all look to the only place that's not being churned up and has industrial capacity, and it's the United States. So America pays farmers to produce an abundance of food, as well as the market prompting them to produce an abundance of food. It's subsidized by the government, and so the government is essentially incentivizing people to buy land, grow food, and grow lots of it. When World War I comes to an end, all these farmers realise, hold on a sec, there's actually no one to sell it to, because all the farmers are going home in the UK, they're going home in France, they're starting up again, and the subsidies come to an end as well from the American government.
The interesting part about that too, and again, it links into what will be discussed in more depth in the next episode, but the person who oversaw the last part of this process of the food from the United States being distributed into Europe and saw the benefit of that economically was Herbert Hoover.
Yeah.
Who, again, when we'll come to him later on, you would think there would be a broader understanding of what the economy actually involved at that point in time and how subsidies could be useful. But the problem with that is that in 1920, obviously, Harding comes into power. And the Republican Party is not in favour of subsidies. They are laissez-faire.
Yeah, hands off.
Hands off the economy. The economy runs itself. Everything. We don't do this. So not only do they now not have people to provide the food to, but the farmers aren't even being subsidised anymore by the government, because you'll succeed or fail based on your own merits. And this is the problem, is that the farmers were put in a position where they had to produce what they produced for the government. They were compelled to improve their production standards by the government to mass produce. And now they're going, we don't actually need that much anymore. And so the cost is now outweighing the benefit.
Yeah.
So you've got a problem where the agricultural sector takes a hit very early in the 1920s.
Yeah. By 1924, there's 2.5 million agriculture employees unemployed. So it's not roaring for them.
No, and it never fully recovers. It doesn't really bounce back at all.
Yeah.
And this
in fact, it turns into the Dust Bowl.
Yeah, and when people talk about this idea of who could have seen the Great Depression coming, look at the agricultural sector. It was coming for a very long time.
Yeah, even if it wasn't going to be a depression of global proportions, it was certainly going to be an internal recession in the agricultural side of things. And the other aspect of the global trade network that the United States sort of stuffs up here is that they whack on tariffs to imports. And so it makes things made and grown in other countries coming into America more expensive. But of course, if you're wearing that as an importing nation into the USA, you're just going to do the same to American goods. So Britain and France will just whack tariffs onto American imports and make them more expensive, particularly food, because they see that as the large plank within which they'll be able to rebuild their economies. So the tariff wars of the 20s really exacerbate the issues, firstly at the agricultural level, but then later on at the sort of whole economy level.
And this is the thing, you get like the Ford and McCumber Tariff Act, for example, and stuff like that, and eventually we get down to the Hawley Smoot Tariff Act down the line. But this idea of America's first reaction is to block everybody else out, but still expect that their goods should be purchased. Right? It's that double standard. And again, I think it's sort of, I mean, the world at this point in time, in Europe in particular, while they are kind of forced in a way to sort of engage with American consumerism.
So I have to in the early years.
You kind of do have to. But you can almost hear that while they're doing it, they're not doing it out of any joy. And they're doing it in such a way where they're like, the second we can not do this, we're going to not do this because we just don't trust you.
The reason the rest of the world's forced to engage with American consumerism is because all these are recovering economies from the First World War. So all these countries, Britain, France in particular, their industrial capacity was geared towards war production. So they've got to unwind that and then rebuild for a consumer economy. On the other side, they're also highly inefficient because America is a young nation. They haven't been doing industrialization since the steam engine was first invented. They can buy the newest and the best and build the newest and the best without worrying about it. They've got the incoming capital, which we can talk about later. They've also got the manpower and the unaffected raw capital, that is the resources, to factor into those industrial factories. So there's not terribly much to stop America from being this exercised power across the world that the rest of the world has to engage with.
They also have this ability to develop like new industry. They have the ability to develop new industries because they are founding new states, they're founding new territories. Like, again, there's a couple of examples of this. So obviously, first of all, the most potent example of this is Ford. Right, and what Henry Ford does with regards to the production line and the way that the production line moves out of just car manufacturing and becomes sort of a catch cry for everybody in industry to go, well, we could all do this, which streamlines our production. It means we can produce more of the goods. We're more efficient with what we produce. It lowers our costs. The more goods we produce at this rate, the better it's going to be for all of us. Other businesses take that up. And then you start getting things like the radio becomes mass-produced as well because they can do that. And everyone goes from producing all of one thing, so like one person, three people working on one car, to everybody works on like the door or the panel or the roof. And it means that streamlining that production, and again, it all comes off that idea of the meat processing plant, and that's where the idea came from, was watching meat go around a packing plant and going, why are we not doing this for everything else? The other industry that sort of is developed at this time, which is another example of what America can do that no one else has the ability to do, is creating an entire film industry, which is part of this idea of the boom, is this idea of, well, look at Hollywood. And the creation of Hollywood is a secondary part of this boom industry. Now, we'll talk about both of them. We'll start with talking about the actual production of goods. But Hollywood is built because California has all of the seasons within a 5-kilometre radius of the studios, and there's nothing there. No one is moving over there. It's sort of a bit of a dead area. What are we going to do with this area? Oh, no, we'll build some film studios because we can go use mountains and beaches.
It's cheap.
It's cheap. The land was cheap. And then that now becomes a massive industry for the United States. But it's the consumerism that leads that. And it's the drive of things like, do you want the new washing machine? Do you want the new car? Do you want a radio? And America can produce these goods because the rest of the world, as you pointed out, is recovering from, 4 years of war basically on the doorstep, if not ravaging the country.
Yeah, certainly the Western population centre of Europe, it can't rise to this level of demand, and so America just fills the void. I like to trace the development of all the goods and gadgets of the 20s from the advent of electricity.
Yes.
So electricity, by and large, is a known thing by 1920. It's coming. It's something that's been around. But the rapidity within which it is spreading is a big thing. So here's a relatively clean, and those days exceptionally clean, form of electricity, but exceptionally cheap as well. And that's what powers automation, so what we'd have with Henry Ford. Now all of a sudden workers, there are less physical demands on them. You don't need to be the blue-collar worker that we now typify with factories. And there's a rise in demand for technically skilled workers as well as workers who aren't necessarily going to drive engines but now do accounting and clerkship. So this is the emergence of the white-collar middle class. And it's the white-collar middle class that starts demanding stuff to spend their new money on because technical skills attract a higher wage and the middle class are higher paid than the working class. They then say, well, what can we now spend our money on? We can spend it on lighting our house with electricity. We can now get hot water systems. We can buy radiators, cookers, refrigerators. We can buy cleaning chemicals, polishing chemicals, radio, movies. The impact of tin cans on food now means food can be preserved, so you can now buy stuff from other countries and it still be fresh. You've got greater modes of transportation. Trains are now no longer an elite thing. You don't need a horse, you can buy a car. A quarter of all households in the United States have a car by this point. You can now travel around the world as long as you're not planning on flying anyway, because that's not quite there yet.
Not there yet.
But another thing that comes out is the leisure industry, which gets back towards entertainment and Hollywood.
And the thing is that the leisure industry, and we'll get to how people did pay for all this in a moment, but the leisure industry became the thing that, because there was this idea of, and this is sort of the era of the Keeping Up with the Joneses boom.
Oh, yes.
This is where this happens, whereas they've got a washing machine, we need a washing machine. But part of this, then, you wanted to push this idea of leisure and you wanted to push this idea of, opulence, really, is what you wanted to do. Everything was wonderful. Everything was amazing. Everything was brilliant. So California sort of becomes the thing because the studios open up. So you get Warner Brothers, RKO, Columbia, Paramount. They all open up these big lots. And again, it's because of the scenic nature of Hollywood. It's because of the fact that, there's snow-capped mountains like half an hour from a beach. You've got the prairie area, so you can go out and film westerns and those sorts of things. Then you get the development with the electricity as well of things like the talkies. So you start getting, by 1927, the talkies are a thing. Which were good for a lot of careers, bad for a lot of other careers. There were a lot of careers that ended because when they opened their mouth, they went, "Oh no, that's what you sound like." But you've got people like, for example, Charlie Chaplin becomes a massive star at this point in time. You get all of these sort of big changes along that sort of leisure. You also get the other thing we didn't really mention so much around the 1920 election is the 1920 election is the first election where women can actually, get involved. Again, not all, but some women.
Yeah, and that's where you ask this question, the 1920 election for who?
Right, and this is where you get, there's two big things we do need to discuss before we push ourselves into some of the financial issues. One of them is the role of women and the idea of the flapper culture and the idea of this sort of jazz age. Now, contrary to what the movies will lead you to believe, a majority of women did not suddenly start going out to night spots, smoking cigarettes and drinking with the short hair.
No, it's a very narrow segment. And this is where understanding women's history is very nuanced. So even, to take the 1970s feminist movement, to take this, it is primarily a white middle and upper middle class phenomena. And it is certainly not something that spans the rural-urban divide. So a lot of the things we talk about here with booms and new gadgets and increased wages and all of that, it doesn't spread very far from the cities in and of themselves, but also all of these benefits are really being channeled into this emergent middle class and upper middle class. Certainly your destitute and your impoverished people see none of this. Certainly the working class sees less of a benefit from this. The privileged class sees not much change in their privilege. It's this new emergent white middle class that sees it, because it's certainly not going to be afforded to the African Americans of the time or the Native Americans of the time, although I all of a sudden started disliking that phrase, Native America, suggesting they're native to that America,
yes,
which is just an oxymoron in and of itself. But all the people, the migrants from Latin America who are coming in, the Asian migrants from China, the Japanese migrants into white, none of these people are afforded the benefits of the Roaring Twenties to any degree that is reflective of that white middle class and upper middle class, very narrow vein of people. So yes, to say that all these jazz bars and speakeasies later on are being filled with a diverse group of people, it would be a false statement.
Yeah, I mean, it also comes back down to that idea of again, grouping women as an historical group.
Yes.
They're not. Like, it's the same. It's a diverse range of opinions and a diverse range of views and a diverse range of experiences. Again, you look at the role for African-American women during the Great Depression. Like, it's significantly changed. Every group experienced everything differently, right? And this is something that I think is often a very easy way to sort of categorise these histories, is to go, well, women's rights were vastly improved from what they had been, and the women all went out and they got short hair and flapper dresses and went out and drank and smoked, and the morality decay. Well, I mean, at the same time, you have the women and the temperance movement,
yes,
who drive that 1920 election, which is what drives the idea towards prohibition and the impact that prohibition has. Because on one hand, you've got this, it's a really interesting dichotomy with the United States at this time. The leisure movement is a massive drive, this idea of leisure time and leisure activities and the freedom opening up. And at the same time, you've got America pushing towards prohibition. And it's this interesting mixture of the two. And it's interesting to watch the way now that when you get a lot of revisionist histories or you get a lot of popular histories, they kind of almost gloss past the whole prohibition thing largely, because they're like...
Or they focus in on it as a...
Completely.
That's it, and not explore the tension.
Fact that there's tensions between the two. On one hand, America presents itself as this roaring party that's amazing and wonderful. And
not just a roaring party, but a government where we're not going to tell you how to live your life, except when it comes to drink.
You can't have booze. Yeah. And it's such a... like, the very fact that the temperance movement had that success, which in itself, if you actually look at the way the vote went down in Congress, is a minor miracle that it actually passed.
Yes.
Like, the fact that America in this period of time also pushes the prohibition movement is insane. Like, you wouldn't expect it. It's the most random thing. It's like if you're one of those people who believes in the idea that reality is a simulation, it does feel like that's the moment the simulation bugged briefly, and a save from a different game sort of got imported in. It's like, what do you mean there's no booze? Where did it go? And, of course, that's an interesting thing too, especially when we're talking about agricultural production and the issues of agricultural production. And at the same time, barley and all the stuff that's required, all the stuff that's required for production, they go, no booze. So suddenly the people who are out there farming, who are already being hit really hard, not only is the government not helping them, they're actively preventing them.
Yeah, here's a potential for recovery, and no, you can't have it.
Yeah, so this is this weird dichotomy of the United States, but it's okay because they've got goods and they've got things. And how do you buy these goods in a time where it's a boom? Well, you could save money. That's definitely a way to do it. You can work hard, and again, this is a Republican belief: is that if you work hard, everything good will come to you, and you will be rich beyond your wildest dreams. The other Republican belief was credit's a good thing.
Yeah, the credit phenomena is the fundamental flaw and strength of the Roaring Twenties. Sort of got to backtrack, and sorry to bring it back to this, but you got to backtrack to the United States' role in World War One. They go from being a debtor nation, borrowing from Britain primarily, but also France and Germany and I was going to say Russia there, but that wasn't happening.
No, the Russians weren't loaning money anyway.
They're lining their own pockets. But they went from a debtor nation to a creditor nation. They were then handing out the loans to all these countries. And so now the United States is living through the 20s off interest payments from these loans. Yeah. But the loans don't decrease. The loan amounts increase because now they need to start loaning to Germany to make their own repayments with the Treaty of Versailles, which is a whole complex web that there's a mini episode devoted to. But suffice to say, the 1920s are funded by the interest payments from Europe on the loans that were given out to get through World War I. Now, this then creates greater trade outlets because Europe is not only recovering but also begging to try and rebuild. And so America doesn't have to worry about raising their own revenue and then facilitating and stimulating their own economy. It's naturally being stimulated, and so there's greater trade opportunities. Those greater trade opportunities mean greater industrial production, and so you can turn the World War I manufacturing into consumerism, which we've already covered.
And that's the thing, is that America goes from viewing credit as, it's a bit worried about that because they've been in debt, to suddenly, hey, isn't credit fantastic? Like, we can make a lot of money off this. And that's where you start getting things like, first of all, you get higher purchase and credit.
Yeah.
But secondly, also, then you start getting stores that go, hey, we could sell a bunch of things. So you start getting things like JCPenney and all of the big sort of stores. That idea of that large department store also develops around this time.
Well, this is the emergence of Woolworths.
Yeah, because the idea goes from you go and buy something from a mum and pop sort of
because you couldn't afford everything.
No. But now, with higher purchase and credit, you can afford everything in that store.
And all those goods and gadgets we ran off, you can buy it on credit, interest payments, and you'll pay it off. And nowhere in your mind did you think this was ever going to come to an end. And so consequently, in 30 years I'll still be paying off my car. So be it. Let the good times roll.
And the other thing is, too, that you also didn't worry about it because the people next door had gone out and bought theirs. So you're like, I need to have what they have. There is this driven economy and this driven competitive nature.
But then comes the issue of when you own everything and you're still accumulating income, what the heck do you do with all this money that's sitting around? So you need to start speculating on things. You need to start speculating on buying this and selling it tomorrow or the week after because it goes up. When I say this, I mean largely stocks, bonds and land. So
to do that, you would need to have a country that was geared towards business. Now, obviously this goes back to the government, and we need to have a bit of a conversation about the year of 1923 because the year of 1923 is a fascinating year and a very important year. The reason it's so important is that Warren Harding decides he's going to go to the West. He's going to California, and he's going to go out there, and he's going to give a bunch of speeches and sort of motivate the base.
Motivate them back to calm down and go back to normal.
Exactly, get themselves ready for 1924 in a big way. And what he does instead is he follows the Wilson principle, except he takes it to a new whole level in that he actually drops dead. So 3 years, and if you actually look at what he did, it was scandal. But that's okay, because if you thought that Warren Harding was a moderate man, you ain't seen nothing yet. Ladies and gentlemen, Silent Cal.
Silent Cal.
Any president whose nickname is Silent Cal, that's an issue. Calvin Coolidge, the Vice President of the United States, becomes president, and he is the man who has the mantra of the business of America is business. And this is where that speculation idea comes from, is, well, we've done everything else. Why don't we just start getting into the market? Now, again, not everyone gets into the market. It's the wealthy who are in the marketplace. So, and this is going to become more relevant, obviously, in our next episode where we talk about 29. Yeah. But there are enough people speculating in the market that it is going to have an economic effect on the country as a whole.
Yeah, there's a massive increase in domestic confidence in America and this goes back to that American exceptionalism. The economy will always grow because that's what was promised at the end of World War I. We are in a new era of unbridled and never-ending peace and prosperity, and the 20s are reflective of that. But that increasing confidence leads to increasing investment, especially amongst this middle class who's working for greater wages than the technically trained people who are now richer than they've ever imagined. And that greater confidence leads to people going into shareholding where you can make massive profits in a day if you're switched on with the process, or alternatively, massive losses, as we will see later.
This goes back to it's interesting because this is sort of the starting point of what was in 2007 line too big to fail.
Yes.
But this is the starting point.
Well, all of that 2007 fiasco is what happens when you unwind all the lessons and legislations of what happens in 1929.
Exactly. And this is the thing. Like, you could look at this, and obviously 29 is the thing that happens first. But then this is, again, what happens in 2007 is, again, what happens here. You get this build up and build up and build up, and there's credit flying all over the place.
And no one stops and thinks.
And no one goes, some point that's not going to work anymore. Now, you would have thought that America might have stopped and paused for thought in 1924 because we have an election. So in 1924, we have an election between, obviously it's going to be whoever the Republican nominee is. Presumptively, that would be the vice president, who is now the president, Calvin Coolidge, and he picks Charles Dawes for his running mate. Dawes will become very important,
yes.
As we'll see in a moment. Now, they decided to make some adjustments. They thought that the South was too represented and changed the delegates.
Without getting much representation for African Americans who were largely filling up the South, they're still too represented.
So there were really only 3 candidates that ran. Coolidge ran, although you'd barely know it because it's Cal. Then you get Hiram Johnson, he's back again.
I'm back.
And then you get Senator Robert La Follette Sr. I love, again, he's got the greatest. I do recommend look him up because his photos have some of. He also has some of the greatest poses. Like his pose that he sort of does in one of the photos it's the hands locked, leaning like he's a matinee idol of the 1930s, 1940s. It's absolutely spectacular. The ballot doesn't really take that much. It's pretty straightforward. The bigger ballot is about who's going to be the vice president, because obviously that's a bit vacant, and you might need to actually have a vice president. Now, Loudon runs for it again, who ran for the presidency. He goes, I might be vice president because, look, I'm one heart attack away.
It still says president.
Instead, you get the White House budget director, Charles Dawes.
Oh, another very important man.
So, again, Charles Dawes will become a bit more important. Let's talk about the Dems.
Oh, do we have an hour?
Because 24 is interesting. 24 is the year of Klan upheaval at the conventions. They turn up to the Republican convention, and the Republicans actually think about making a statement about the Klan. Then they decide, no, we're not going to do that. But it's a bit umming and ahhing.
Yeah, the Klan at this time is very popular.
The Democrats have a whole other conversation about this because, you see, the Democrats have very strong Klan support at this time.
The origins of the Democrats are in the South.
Yes.
And the Democrats were the sort of largest supporters of the maintenance of slavery through the American Civil War. They were the party off the South, and so that largely meant the white landed gentry, which then became the white landed people.
Yep.
And then as a consequence, their origins are going to be tied up with Democrats, but not necessarily the Democratic Party.
No.
So Democrats populated the party and probably drove the party, but that's not to say the Ku Klux Klan is the party, the arm of the party.
And you get a really interesting debate that happens at the 24 convention, because you get at the 24 convention you've got people who are very firmly anti-Klan, including Oscar Underwood from Alabama, who are trying to get condemnation put into the party platform, condemning them. You've got, at the same time, you've also got FDR, who makes an appearance, who he puts Al Smith forward as a candidate, who he calls him the Happy Warrior. Al Smith is Catholic.
Yeah.
That did not go down very well with the Klan members there and the people who supported the Klan. And what we also get is the return of McAdoo. This time, McAdoo is kind of backed by very sympathetic Klan people. And McAdoo has this Klan backing because they see him as the best hope to stop anybody who's a Catholic becoming probably a presidential nominee. Also, anyone who is against prohibition. Because, of course, the Klan are very happy with this idea of, no, we don't want, we want prohibition to stay. We don't want this booze out there, which is really interesting. McAdoo, again, looks like he's going to run away with this. It's the second time we look like, McAdoo's going to run away
there
with
we go.
Only for John Davis to win the nomination. Who?
Yeah.
Yep, exactly.
A footnote.
And the vice presidential nominee is Charles Bryan of Nebraska.
Who?
Sure. So the whole reason to mention the 24 convention is, one, the Klan, and we're about to talk about the Klan because, boy, don't they make an appearance in the 1920s. But secondly, Roosevelt, again, he's been nominated for vice president in 1920. In 1924, he gives a speech that really opens the door for him to make the move towards New York and get himself involved as governor of New York, which is going to be his launching platform in 32.
It's almost like conventions set the stage for potential presidents to come out and show their
possibly
stuff.
win between red states and blue states.
Yes.
Never happened before or since. Meanwhile, in the election, it's really interesting because you've got, if you think about the 1924 election, on one hand there's boom. On the other hand, you've had 3 years of Harding.
Scandal,
death. Then Calvin Coolidge, who is famous for saying absolutely nothing about anything, and it's still a walkover. 382 electoral votes to 136. La Follette then runs as a progressive independent and gets himself 13 electoral votes.
See, why wouldn't you?
So, I mean, the biggest disappointment that I have at this point in time, though, is obviously we don't have our friend. There's no socialist.
There's no Mr. Debs.
No, Eugene Debs does not have any form of footprint in this election.
No.
Look, I just love the 1920 election because I just love Eugene Debs having such a major role.
Yeah.
But we end up with Silent Cal. Now,
I think the election of Coolidge is just proof all politics is economics.
Yeah.
And if your wallet is growing fatter and your bank account is getting extra zeros on it, you're just going to vote for anyone who's promising you that.
Yeah, Calvin Coolidge is a fascinating study of presidency insofar as finding things that Coolidge does is really hard. He basically sits in the office for 4 years. Or 5 if you count the extra year he does. Yeah. You want to talk about laissez-faire economics. His idea is laissez-faire government. It's, I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to stay in the White House and just let whatever plays out, play out. And that includes things like the rise of the Klan.
Yeah. It's interesting to see how Coolidge is going through quite a resurgence in terms of popularity amongst more conservative and right-wing historians right now. A number of sort of pundits out there and historians have really made the rounds over the past year or two, espousing the greatness of Coolidge by pointing specifically at nothing and that's what a president should be doing. And they largely could be categorized as originalists when it comes to, say, the Constitution, where there's not necessarily all that much power carved out for the executive branch. In addition, they believe in that sort of conservative interpretation of economics or laissez-faire economics where hands-off is best, and that's what leads to great prosperity. And they point to the 20s and that when Coolidge is doing nothing, the country is going gangbusters, and it's when Hoover comes in and tries to do something, and FDR later also tries to do something, that things are really problematic for the Great Depression. If they just ridden it out, it would have been no problem. So it's interesting to see how the sort of fortunes, or the historical fortunes of historians writing about presidents sort of ebb and flow depending on their slant.
So what you end up getting with the Coolidge presidency is basically the American economy is just allowed to continue to be the American economy. They're not going to stop what's going on. There's no check going to happen on credit. They're just going to let credit roll because it's like, what's the problem? Like, everything is fantastic. We don't have any issues. Again, Ford is held up as this paragon of business virtue, and this is what you need to be doing in business. Again, at this point in time, Henry Ford decides to do things like diversify in terms of we can have more than one type of car. And then you get all the competitive companies that have started up in cars who we can do the same thing, different price points. And again, it's this idea of spend, and this American...
Because it's never going to end.
No, this idea of the American prosperity and the idea of this American boom is never going anywhere. They're going to continue to grow forever. And the Coolidge presidency is just more, well, I'll just let you do whatever you're doing. I'll just sit over here if you need me. But you're not going to need me, and I'm not going to do much.
The things that they do. One thing in large part, and both of the two things largely comes down to lack of race relations. So one of the big things is the Immigration Act, especially in 24.
what they do with immigration in the United States is basically that whole idea of bring me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, and they look at that and go, well, we could, but we could also not.
Yeah.
And basically there's a move towards making America very white.
Yeah.
They do what a lot of white Western countries do, which is they start to put up boundaries around people who are not white coming into their country. There's definitely an Anglo tilt towards the policy. Irish and British, yay. Everyone else, not really. If we have to, but not really.
And even by the Great Depression, it's largely all the affluence and wealth is being reserved for native-born Americans. And when I say that, I mean white people born in America, because by 1929, 150,000 immigrants were let in every year. Even if you're off that select few, you have to try and find your place in there. So the affluence is being reserved for native-born Americans. And it also has this side effect of driving up wages because there's not enough workers to fill all the employment positions in the United States at this point. So a worker can reasonably go to their boss and say, wage increase, or I'll go across the road to the other factory who's promising me more anyway. So there's an economic side to the restriction of immigration, but there's also the racial side of things where America at this point in time is hardly an inclusive society which is looking out for the diverse population of it. The Native Americans are just a footnote to this whole point, still maltreated and still largely not advocated for until Herbert Hoover comes around. And then also at the same time, African Americans are not included at all in the discussions of the Roaring Twenties, and the migration issue that we just covered doesn't really create a plurality of experience. Yeah,
so what the Americans do, and I mean, look, the first part of the policy, we sort of have to dip back a little bit. They introduced a literacy test as early as 1917. But then in 1921, you've got the Quota Act, which comes in, which limits 357,000 a year. But only 3% of the total population of any group already in the United States.
Yes.
So the way they do it is not to say you can't come in, but they go 3% of any group in the United States and use that as their measuring stick to sort of stop it. That's also followed then by the Origins Act of 24, which brings it back down to 150,000 a year, and 2% based on the population of the USA in 1890. So they're not even going off current numbers. No. They just backtrack it to 1890.
Yeah, before the big wave of migration.
So basically they work out sort of crafty ways of sort of doing that. Now, there is one country that is excluded from this, Mexico.
Yes.
Because cheap labour is cheap.
Yeah, this is a time where the border between America and Mexico was largely non-existent. Like, you wouldn't talk about putting up a wall or a fence. Farmers knew each other over the border and would willingly go and work with each other. It was such a fluid situation, which is the irony of the times right now.
Yeah, I mean, Coolidge is famous for saying America must be kept for the Americans, and that's sort of a very interesting way for him to sort of do that. You've also got, we talk a lot about, you know, the Red Scares of the McCarthyism and those sorts of things. But the first Red Scare is 1919. You got all these race riots happening in 1919. There's mail bombs happening. They attack the Attorney General's house. There's a bomb on Wall Street killing people. And you've got this sort of all of these things happening which lead to the Palmer raids.
Yes, and this is where J. Edgar Hoover cuts his teeth.
Yes.
And it's no surprise that the FBI, under his leadership, when McCarthy's going off, is so anti-communist.
So the raids were basically, they went off and they claimed there were 150,000 communists in the country.
That's a very precise number.
It's a very interesting number.
What happens if someone gave birth to a child? And it was a communist child?
What's the percentage off?
That's 151.
Oh, no,
150,001.
He also is one of the times, and one of the things you see with any Red Scare globally is, you know, they're in the Parliament. He suggests they might be in Congress. And so what he does is they go off and they start raiding left-wing organisations. And so what you end up having is 6,000 arrests, 556 people deported under the Alien Act of 1918, police basically attacking the groups they dislike, and the trade unions are all being weakened at the same time. Now, no trials were being held for these people, by the way. It was just a case of, we've got a little bit of evidence, you're out.
Yeah, it's good enough.
It's basically a way for them to deal firmly with what they see as a red menace. But in the meantime, just to sort of stop any organisation that might oppose a lot of their ideas. And so you end up with this really big issue around that. But that also then leads to the KKK feeling like they've got a lot more freedom to just do whatever they want. Because immigrants and migrants and African Americans are clearly not going to be protected. So let's just go nuts.
Yeah, if your government is issuing out edicts and laws that reflect your values, you buy into that government. But if your government is handing out edicts and laws in line with the KKK's value, they're going to come out of the woodworks. And that's where KKK popularity really skyrockets in the 20s, up to 4 million members.
Yeah, their largest membership is the 1920s.
Now, I don't want to – this is not going to sound good. I don't want to be a KKK apologist, but the Rands, the racism that we attribute to them now, while still there, is second place to nationalism at this time. They're a pro-America, America first sort of nation. Yes, they're still racist. They're burning crosses and they're going after migrant populations, but it's all packaged in this patriotism, which America becomes appealing to the larger population.
It's all about that America for the Americans idea, which is not seen. It's not seen by them as being a racist statement. It's seen as being a nationalist.
Nationalist, yes.
And again, because the idea again, we're talking a lot about Republicans with this, obviously, but there was a Democratic candidate in the 1920s whose campaign slogan was "Ship or Shoot."
Yep.
And this is the thing: the way that the way that immigrants were treated, the way that people who were African Americans were being treated, the amount of xenophobia that was inbuilt as part of nationalism and in the name of waving the American flag. Was something that, again, it would be something that would be repeated time and time again. Why? Because it was easy to do.
It works.
Now, the other problem with this is that because of prohibition, we also see the rise in organised crime.
Yes.
Right? And this is because you see mafia interests start going, well, we can supply booze. And again, it's the other thing with prohibition that's often referred to is it is an unenforceable piece of legislation. It's an unenforceable amendment of the Constitution because so many people were willing to break the prohibition laws. But the reason why this becomes an issue around deportation and around immigrants is because it was seen as being, especially the Italian immigrant families, who were the organised crime gangs. So then that could be linked by morals campaigners to go, look at the crime. It's all linked to foreigners. Yep. Let's get the foreigners out of here. And so they were able to use prohibition again, first of all, as a rod to beat people with in general about morals. But secondly, they could double down on that and link it into nationalism and, well, we didn't have this much crime until these foreigners came to our shores.
Yeah, this is where New York centralised itself as the sort of linchpin for most of organised crime because in the 1890s, which is why they use that date as the census point for the 2% and the 3% quotas, what they do is in the 1890s, Italian migrants come over to America and they land in New York and they take up residency in a city that is largely filled with small boroughs and they set up little clan areas, they set up little hotspots and different types of Italians live in other types of areas. But through this sort of unity amongst their own national identities comes mafia-style organisations, which then eventually turns into the mafia. So by the time the 1920s come around, New York's largely been carved up amongst Italian leadership groups, so to speak, organised crime gangs, and there's clear demarcations, and they occupy largely this time prostitution and gambling until alcohol becomes a hot commodity. The same can be said of Illinois as well, further inland into the Midwest, and then also cities further south such as New Jersey. But yes, the Italian nature or the Italian connection to it is where one element or the racial element of getting rid of alcohol serves a dual purpose. The other part is the sort of Christian appeal to it as well. The idea of the temperance movement is certainly grounded in waspy ideas, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants.
Which is another reason why the KKK absolutely adore it.
Exactly.
It is those white Christian values which they are holding so dear.
Yeah, not these Irish people who get drunk, not these Italian organised crimes. We're white Protestants and we know what we're doing.
Exactly. We are very much the right-thinking people and we're being led astray by these horrible vices and sins.
Yes.
In terms of the rest of the Coolidge period, it's kind of a bit of an empty sort of period in terms of any other reform or any other. It just sort of ticks along. The one thing, there are a couple of things we need to get to before we finish off. And we're going to we'll finish off talking about, obviously the 28 election and what happens, because that does become a little bit important, just a teensy bit.
Mm-hmm.
But the last thing I want to sort of get to on a foreign policy front before we sort of talk about Hoover at the end of this is we need to have a talk about possibly what ends up long-term being the most important foreign policy development. I'm talking about Washington Naval Conference. Because the Washington Naval Conference would have very long-term ramifications and would probably, when we talk about this idea of America's isolationism and World War II, and the idea that it's American isolationism that drives that war and it's Treaty of Versailles that drives that war, Washington Naval Conference has a fair bit to answer for.
Yeah, certainly when we talk about World War II, and when we get there, it's important to talk about the two World War IIs because the Eastern and the Western theatres of conflict are spurred by different things.
Different agendas.
So, yeah, it could be said that the Treaty of Versailles has an outsized influence on the emergence of war in Europe, but it doesn't necessarily have as much influence on the emergence of war in Asia. A lot of the things America has been doing through the 20s is just poking Japan more and more and more. Now, that's not to excuse Japan and their actions, far from it, but it's a narrative that we can start to see looking backwards. These immigration quotas and acts were slapped on to Chinese and Japanese migrants, and they took that as an affront. The denial of the Racial Equality Act in the Treaty of Versailles was an affront. The Washington Naval Conference will be seen as an affront to them.
So the idea of the Washington Naval Conference is this idea of, again, one of the great sentences of all time is the way to disarm is to disarm. And I'm like,
sounds true.
Genius, man, genius. The idea of proposing the 10-year holiday in the construction of the capital ships. But it didn't mean that it carried over to all of the fleet. So battleships and your heavy cruisers and your aircraft carriers were going to be either a holiday or limited.
Yeah.
And the limitation is where Japan starts getting, I think quite rightly, upset.
Yep.
Is we're going to anchor it to the size of the fleet and the size of our fleet, and you can build within this percentage of what we have.
Yeah, and this is where the sort of double standards of American politics stands out. Henry Cabot Lodge arguing for American sovereignty and no other country will tell us how to run our country, and then America goes and tells Japan how many boats they can build.
Yes, exactly. Now, the other interesting part of this too is it doesn't end up limiting all ships.
No, because you got to think Great Britain certainly has, a 400-year history of a modern navy. The United States had been formulating their navy for slightly longer than Japan. Japan's not building hunks. They're building new ships, whereas the size that they're being measured against is inclusive of all American ships. So that includes their best and their worst. And for Britain, their best and their worst ships. But Japan is building only the best. So, they can only build largely 60% to America's 100%. But in that 60%, it's more efficient, better quality, higher value ships compared to the 100% that Japan is measured against in the United States.
Yeah. So what America kind of sort of does here is not only do they poke Japan,
agitate it,
but they poke them and they agitate them and then give them a reason to go, well, we'll just make sure that what we build is better than anything you've got. Just in case.
Just in case we need it.
Never know when we're going to need it. And again, like Lodge has already said, for example, we don't want to come down on the Japanese side of a war with Japan and China. He's already made it very public that he doesn't want anything to do with Japan. So this is sort of, again, there's a lot of poking going on in this era. We leave out of this because that will come back when we get into the next phase, because the next phase is heading towards war. But we need to talk about Hoover. And we need to talk in particular about the election of Herbert Hoover as the President of the United States. So obviously Calvin Coolidge is the President of the United States. He wins the 24 election. You would barely know it because he hardly exists in like anywhere really. When we're dealing with Hoover becoming president, there's a couple of things that sort of become interesting. First of all, Coolidge doesn't seek re-election, and I think the large reason why Coolidge decides not to seek re-election is because he's kind of bored by what he's doing. He's not doing anything. He doesn't really feel the need to. Hoover, who has tried to become the nominee previously, gets absolutely nowhere. He's tried previously. Again, he got like 5% of the vote in his first attempt. Went absolutely nowhere near it. Got nowhere close. Coolidge goes, I don't really want to do this. I'm not really that interested. If I'm going to sit around, I'd rather sit around at home board and not have to sit around at board in the White House.
No one asked me questions.
No. Like, people don't expect me to possibly make a speech at some point. Whereas, I'm expected to speak to people. I'm not doing that. So Herbert Hoover becomes the nominee for president in 1928. And it's a really wide open race. But sort of Hoover doesn't even perform that well. It looks like Loudon might finally have his win, only for Loudon to pull out as they get to the convention and go no. And so you end up with basically Hoover on the first ballot. Dawes is put forward as potentially being the nominee again as vice president. But Hoover goes, I'm not going to interfere, but I really want Charles Curtis. Charles Curtis is
very important vice president.
Charles Curtis is interesting. He is a nominee who is the first person nominated to high office in the United States, who's elected to high office in the United States, who is Native American background.
Yeah, this is a little factoid that popped up when Kamala Harris was elected as vice president, and all the headlines were saying, first female minority vice president. And it was important they said female because Curtis was a Native American, identified and had their paternal and maternal heritage offered, and was known as, by the larger body politic, as a Native American. Not necessarily publicly known by the wider voting population, but certainly amongst his inner circle, he knew it. Has been criticised not being the most pro-Indian or pro-Native American politician, but I feel like it was a good bookend to a time of prosperity and hope for the United States. Yeah,
it was really interesting because Hoover runs against Al Smith.
Yes.
Now, we talked about having a Native American person as the running mate of Hoover, but the most controversial part of this election is Al Smith.
Yes.
Al Smith was a Catholic, which obviously made him deeply unpopular with the Klan for a start.
Largely offensive to a lot of the people.
Well, largely offensive to everybody in the United States, really. It was, again, it's the first we have a Roman Catholic nominee for president. This is something that was unusual. Like, it was incredibly unusual that it wouldn't be really until you get to the Kennedys, where you see, okay, we can actually have, and again, Kennedy, and we'll get to him obviously, has to say, I'm not a Roman Catholic president, I'm a president who happens to be Roman Catholic. Al Smith actually gets thumped in this election, but it's not an election that's particularly engaging. Neither side cares. The Republicans aren't really locked in behind Herbert Hoover. It's just that he's the next Republican up.
Yeah.
The Democrats aren't locked in behind Al Smith because there's a large percentage of the Democrats who don't like the Catholic. Yeah. So you've got Al Smith runs, he gets 87 electoral votes. He only carries 8 states. Hoover gets 444 with 40 states carried.
It's not surprising, given that the average American voter would look back and say, in the start of the 1920s, we elected Harding, and he was feckless, and there were scandals, but it worked, and so a hands-off president works. Then we elected Coolidge, hands off, said nothing, did nothing, it worked. Here's Hoover, this sort of symbol of American business. He's a philanthropist with a nice little sort of social streak in him. He goes and does the good things when they need to be done, but for the most part, he's a businessman. He'd gone out to Australia as a mining magnate and staked his claims there. He'd struck out on his own. He had paid the dues required to be a great man in American industry. So, how can it go wrong putting a businessman in charge of America?
Well, again, the thing that sort of typifies the weirdness of the 28 election is, again, Hoover's first elected office is President of the United States.
Yeah, prior to this, he'd been Secretary of Commerce.
Yeah, Secretary of Commerce, first elected office is President of the United States. Hadn't been a mayor, hadn't been elected to anything else. His first elected thing was president.
It seems like that might fail consistently.
Yeah.
If you don't have a background in politics and only have a background in business, it doesn't work.
It feels like you might end up, if you do get in as a one-termer.
Yeah, some sort of one-termer because you just don't really know what you're doing.
And quite possibly regarded as a failure. I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's no one coming up, I can say for sure, there's no one coming up on our run of this podcast that's actually going to meet that.
No.
It's a good thing we finish when we do.
Yes.
So, but Hoover takes over, and where we're sort of going to leave this off, obviously, is where this episode of the podcast covers right up until the 1928 presidential election. And so at the end of the 1928 presidential election, we have another win for the Republicans.
Yep.
That is their third term in a row.
Yep.
So that is a very good result for the Republican Party. By the way, future flash forward, the Republicans wouldn't do this again until the election of George Bush, the first one, after Reagan. Like, this is the last time they will win 3 in a row.
On the other hand, one man from the Democratic
man
Party will win 3 3 in a row and sort of scrape in on a fourth and then not quite finish.
And then, maybe have a bit of the Hardings about him. But
keeping that Roosevelt tradition.
They're all taking that Wilson idea to new extremes. It's amazing. But no, in 1928, obviously, where we're leaving it off, America is in boom.
Yeah, and it looks like it's not going to end because nothing has disrupted that train.
It's definitely not going to end, and I think that our next episode, which we'll be dealing with from 1929 onwards, we will be dealing with nothing but the rise of the United States.
It will just be copy-paste, sub out some names.
I think what we're going to hear is the Americans are going to be saying, we'd like to thank you, Herbert Hoover.
Yes, Herbert, you're our hero.
Yeah, Herbert Hoover's name is going to be synonymous in the United States. I think they might name a town after him. They might call it a Hooverville.
A Hooverville.
So,
maybe they're in big monumental projects like dams.
Yeah, dams. I know. Like, think of the amount they're going to build.
Yes.
He's going to be responsible for the building of Mount Rushmore.
That's it.
He's going to be responsible for it. So, but we'll hear how that goes in the next episode of A Brief History of Everything. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. It's been fantastic to be back, as always. Thank you for the feedback on the mini episodes. It's been really good. We will catch you all next time.
Next time.
So, until then, goodbye.
Bye-bye.